She thought she was just giving a lonely old man a reason to live, until 3 black sedans pulled into her dusty parking lot, and a legal team accused her of a multi-million-dollar fraud. The man leading them? A cold-blooded Korean Mafia boss, claiming the silent regular she fed for free wasn't a nobody. He was the chairman of a global empire, and according to the papers in his hand, she just inherited his greatest secret. It had been 14 days since the quiet table in the corner went empty. Janet was scrubbing a grease stain off the counter when the rhythmic hum of the ceiling fan stopped. The diner didn't just go quiet. The oxygen seemed to leave the room. Outside, the desert heat was shimmering off the asphalt, but the 3 men who stepped through the door, they were impossibly cool, impeccable. Clinical precision in every step. They didn't look at the menu. They didn't look at the other customers. They moved with the synchronized weight of a predatory strike. Janet stood frozen, a damp rag still in her hand. 3 years at this diner, she'd seen drifters, truckers, and runaways. But these men? They were the wolves. 2 of them took positions at the door, silent and towering. But the one in the middle? Tailored charcoal suit, a watch that cost more than the building, and eyes so cold they made the diner feel like a morgue. He didn't just look at her. He looked through her. Janet S. Wang? It wasn't a request for confirmation. It was a summons. He didn't wait for her to speak. He walked straight to the back, to Mr. O's table. As he slid a heavy embossed manila folder onto the sticky laminate, Janet felt her heart hammer against her ribs. The man she called a friend was gone, but the world he left behind had just come to collect. The heavy glass door of the diner hadn't even finished settling back into its frame before the atmosphere in the room curdled. Janet stood by the register, her fingers instinctively curling around a damp rag. She watched as the man in the charcoal suit, Han Young, bypassed the "Please wait to be seated" sign with a chilling lack of hesitation. He didn't look at the counter. He didn't look at the scuffed linoleum. He walked with a singular, terrifying focus toward the back corner. He stopped at table 4. Janet felt a sharp pang in her chest. That was Mr. O's table. For 3 years, the elderly man had sat there every morning at 7 a.m., nursing a single cup of green tea and staring out at the highway with eyes that seemed to be watching a movie only he could see. He had been a ghost in a cardigan, a man who thanked her with nothing more than a shallow bow and a rare, crinkled smile. Young pulled the chair out. The sound of the wooden legs scraping against the floor felt like a violation. He sat down, settling into the cracked vinyl with a grace that was entirely too predatory for a roadside diner. He didn't slouch. He sat perfectly upright, his gloved hands resting on the laminate surface, occupying the space with a quiet, lethal authority. "He sat here," Young said. It wasn't a question. His voice was low, carrying a melodic precision that made Janet's skin crawl. Every day, looking at nothing. Janet found her voice, though it sounded thin to her own ears. He liked the light there. It was his spot. Young looked up, his sharp, angular features catching the harsh glow of the overhead fluorescents. Up close, his eyes weren't just cold, they were empty, like the barrel of a gun. Behind him, the 2 men in black suits stood like monolithic sentries, their presence turning the cozy diner into a courtroom. "My father didn't hide in this desert because he liked the light, Miss Wang," Young murmured, his gaze dropping to the table's surface as if he could see the invisible fingerprints left behind. He was the chairman of the Han Young Syndicate. In Seoul, men would lose their lives just for the privilege of standing in his shadow. He was the most feared man in the country. Janet leaned against the counter for support, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. The Mr. O she knew had struggled with his shoelaces and complained about the wind. The man sitting in his chair now was telling her that her quiet friend had been a king of the underworld, and that he had spent his final days being served by a waitress who had no idea she was dancing with a dragon. The older man, the one whose gray hair and folded hands radiated a terrifying sort of composure, cleared his throat. He didn't look like a man about to deliver news. He looked like an undertaker, preparing a body. With a slow, deliberate motion, he reached into the manila folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper, sliding it across the table until it rested just inches from Janet's trembling hands. Mr. O, or rather, Chairman Han, was a man of meticulous habits, the lawyer began, his voice dry and rhythmic, like the ticking of a clock. He didn't believe in charity, Miss Wang. He believed in investments. For 3 years, you provided him with meals, conversation, and companionship. And for 3 years, he provided you with gratuities. Janet's eyes darted to the paper. It was a ledger. Row after row of dates, times, and dollar amounts. Those weren't investments, she whispered, her voice cracking. He left $5, $10, sometimes just the change. It was a tip. That's how this works. In your world, perhaps, Han Young interjected, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. He hadn't moved an inch, his eyes still fixed on her with a predatory stillness. But in my father's world, every cent is a tether. He didn't leave you tips. He was making down payments on a specialized service contract. Every time you pocketed that money and returned to his table the next morning, you were digitally and physically acknowledging a verbal agreement. The older lawyer tapped a specific line at the bottom of the ledger. The number there was staggering, followed by a string of zeros that made Janet's head spin. The chairman's estate has valued the services rendered and the subsequent breach of his family's privacy at a specific premium, the lawyer continued. By accepting those funds, you have inadvertently entered into a binding fiduciary entanglement. Because those tips originated from a dormant offshore account tied to the Han Young syndicate, the legal interest alone has ballooned. You aren't just a waitress anymore, Miss Wang. According to these filings, you are a debtor to the estate in the amount of $50 million. The air in the diner grew thick, the smell of burnt coffee suddenly nauseating. Janet looked from the astronomical figure to Han Young's mask-like face. She felt the walls of the small, dusty diner closing in. The man she had comforted, the man who had sat silently while she talked about her dreams of leaving this town, hadn't been a friend. He had been a trap. And now, the hunter was sitting in his chair, waiting to see if she would run. Han Young leaned forward, the movement slow and controlled, narrowing the space between them until Janet could smell the faint, expensive scent of sandalwood and cold rain clinging to his suit. He didn't look like a man seeking answers. He looked like a scientist dissecting a curious specimen. The silence of the diner deepened, the few remaining customers suddenly finding intense interest in their own plates as the air around table 4 grew heavy with unspoken threats. $50 million, Young repeated, his voice a low, melodic thrum. Most people would scream, some would faint. You just look tired, Miss Wang. Is that part of the act? The exhausted, selfless saint who expects nothing but gives everything? Janet gripped the edge of the laminate table, her knuckles white against the wood. It's not an act. It's a double shift. I'm tired because I work for a living, something I'm guessing you wouldn't understand. A flicker of something, not quite a smile but a tightening of the eyes, passed over Young's face. Oh, I understand work. I understand the labor of social engineering. My father was a man of steel and blood, yet somehow in his final years he became obsessed with this place, with you. He didn't just leave you the land, Janet. He left a series of encrypted memos detailing your kindness. He called you his only honest advisor. He leaned back, his eyes tracking the slight tremor in her hands. But kindness is a currency I don't believe in. No one gives for 3 years without expecting a return. You knew who he was. You saw a lonely, wealthy man and you began to cultivate a legacy. You fed him, you listened to his stories, and you waited for the moment his heart would stop so you could cash in. I didn't even know his real name, Janet snapped, her voice rising in a mix of grief and fury. To me, he was just a man who liked his tea at a specific temperature and hated when the toast was too soft. I didn't want his empire. I wanted him to have a friend. Young's expression didn't soften. He gestured to the lawyer, who placed a sleek silver fountain pen atop the documents. Everyone has a price, Miss Wang. This inheritance comes with a target on its back. My associates want the land for a shipping hub. My enemies want it because my father loved it. If you stay, you'll be crushed between them. So let's skip the theater. Tell me your number. What is the price for you to sign these papers, walk out that door, and never mention my father's name again? Janet didn't pick up the pen. Instead, she turned her back on the $50 million threat and the cold stare of the man behind her. She walked into the kitchen, the swinging stainless steel doors providing a momentary, muffled shield against the silence of the dining room. Her hands were shaking, but as she reached for a small, dented pot and a bag of steel-cut oats, a strange, calm clarity took hold. She didn't reach for the industrial-sized containers or the pre-mixed syrups used for the morning rush. She pulled a small jar of honey from her own locker and a tin of loose-leaf barley tea she had bought at a local market specifically for Mr. O. 20 minutes later, she pushed back through the doors. She didn't carry a check or a signed confession. She carried a tray with a single bowl of oatmeal, topped with a precise swirl of honey and a dash of cinnamon, and a steaming cup of tea. She set it down in front of Han Young, the ceramic clinking softly against the table where the inheritance documents still lay. "Eat," she said, her voice no longer trembling. This was his price. Every morning he'd wait for me to make this exactly like this. Not because it was expensive, but because it was hot and it was consistent. Young looked down at the humble meal, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion that seemed to defy his own logic, he picked up the spoon. He took a single bite. Janet watched as his throat moved, his eyes narrowing as the flavors hit his palate. The silence stretched, thick with the scent of toasted grain and honey. Young's posture didn't break, but something in his eyes shifted, a momentary fracture in the ice. He looked at the steam rising from the barley tea, the same tea his father had likely used to soothe the bitterness of a life built on violence. "It's bland," Young whispered, though he didn't put the spoon down. "It's peace," Janet countered softly. "He told me once that the world outside was too loud. This bowl of oats was the only thing in his life that didn't require him to be a chairman. It just required him to be a man who was hungry." Young stared at the oatmeal as if it were a coded message from the grave. He realized then that he had spent millions trying to track his father's final movements. But a waitress in a red apron had been the only one to actually see him. The secret ingredient wasn't the honey or the cinnamon. It was the fact that for 3 years, Janet had served a ghost without ever asking him to haunt her. Han Young sat staring at the half-empty bowl of oats, his hand still hovering near the spoon as if the simple meal had paralyzed his momentum. The lawyers exchanged a brief, uneasy glance. They were used to seeing him dismantle corporate boards and rival syndicates, not stall over a $5 breakfast. Janet didn't give him time to recover his coldness. She reached into the deep pocket of her red apron and pulled out a small battered notebook with a frayed spiral binding. The cover was stained with coffee rings, and the corners were softened by years of being carried. She didn't hand it to him. She laid it open on the table, covering the legal documents that claimed she owed a fortune. "You called it social engineering," Janet said, her voice a low, steady anchor in the quiet diner. "You think I was tracking his assets, but I was tracking his ghosts." Young's eyes drifted to the pages. They weren't filled with bank account numbers or property values. They were filled with dates and frantic, scribbled shorthand. October 12th, he talked about the sound of the rain in the mountains near his childhood home. November 3rd, he missed the taste of cold pear juice. December 19th, he told me about a son who played the piano until his hands became too heavy with the family name. Young's breath hitched, a sound so soft it was almost a ghost itself. He reached out, his long, elegant fingers tracing the ink of the December entry. "He told you about the piano?" "He told me he stopped listening to the music because he was too busy listening for the sound of his son's footsteps," Janet replied. "He came here because I didn't know who he was, which meant I didn't want anything from him. He didn't have to be a chairman at table 4. He just had to be a man who liked stories." She flipped to the back of the notebook, revealing a pressed, dried wildflower tucked between the pages. He found this in the parking lot last spring. He said it reminded him of his mother's garden before the war took it. He didn't have a safe to put it in, so he gave it to me. Young looked from the fragile, dead flower to the woman standing before him. For the first time, the controlled dominance in his posture cracked. The ledger of kindness was far more incriminating than any legal contract. It proved that while he had spent years guarding his father's empire, he had completely lost the man. Janet hadn't stolen millions. She had preserved the only parts of his father that weren't for sale. The air in the diner had grown thin, the weight of the chairman's secrets pressing against the windows like a physical force. Han Young was still staring at the pressed wildflower in Janet's notebook. His predatory shield finally lowered, when the rhythm of the street outside changed. It started as a low, mechanical growl, the sound of an engine being pushed too hard for a quiet morning. Janet saw it first. A black SUV with tinted windows slowed to a crawl, its tires crunching on the gravel parking lot. The driver's side window slid down with a hiss that sounded like a snake in the grass. "Get down!" Janet screamed, the command tearing through her throat, with a raw authority she didn't know she possessed. She didn't think about the $50 million debt or the cold man who had just threatened her livelihood. She only thought about the space she had curated for 3 years, the sanctuary where a lonely man had finally felt safe. Before Young could even process the shift in the room, Janet lunged across the table. Her hand caught the lapel of his expensive charcoal suit, her momentum slamming him backward out of the chair and toward the floor behind the heavy, reinforced mahogany counter. A split second later, the diner's front windows shattered. The sound was deafening, a jagged, rhythmic percussion of lead hitting glass and wood. Shards of the storefront sprayed through the air like diamond dust, glinting in the fluorescent light before embedding themselves in the vinyl booths. One of the lawyers dove behind a booth, while the younger bodyguard drew a weapon with a blurred speed, returning fire through the cloud of dust. Janet squeezed her eyes shut, her body shielding Young's as they huddled together on the grease-stained linoleum. She could smell the metallic tang of gunpowder and the sudden, sharp scent of ruptured canisters behind the counter. For a heartbeat, the other world, the one Young lived in every day, had spilled over into her own. When the screech of tires signaled the SUV's retreat, the silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. Janet's breath came in ragged gasps, her red apron now dusted with white drywall and broken glass. She looked down and saw Young's eyes. For the first time, they weren't cold. They were wide, reflecting the image of a woman who had nothing to gain, yet had offered herself as a shield. Blood from a small glass cut on Janet's cheek dripped onto his white shirt, a singular, indelible stain on his perfect world. She hadn't just saved his life. She had proven that his father's sanctuary was worth fighting for. The smoke from the gunfire still hung in the air like a localized fog, mixing with the smell of spilled coffee and ozone. Han Young sat on the floor, his back against the industrial refrigerator, looking at the red-stained sleeve of his white shirt. He didn't check his own pulse. He watched Janet, whose hands were still trembling as she wiped the debris from her hair. With a slow, steady hand, he reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a slim, matte black tablet. "My father left a final directive," Young whispered, the coldness in his voice replaced by a hollow, haunting curiosity. He said it could only be opened at the coordinates of his sanctuary after a moment of true clarity. I didn't understand what he meant, until now. He tapped the screen, and the dimly lit space of the diner was suddenly filled with the soft, grainy glow of a video file. The camera was shaky, clearly recorded on a cheap burner phone hidden behind a sugar shaker. The image resolved into the face of Mr. Chairman Han, sitting in the very booth they had just been forced to abandon. He looked older than Janet remembered, but his eyes were bright, focused on something off camera. "Young the old man's voice crackled through the small speakers, speaking in a Korean dialect that was both ancient and tender. "If you are watching this, you have come to claim what you think is yours. You are looking for the gold, the ledgers, the hidden keys. But I did not leave those to you. I left those to the world that made you cold." The camera panned slightly, catching a glimpse of Janet in the background, laughing as she topped off a regular's coffee. "This girl," the chairman continued, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "She gave me a bowl of oats when I was a king, and she gave me her time when I was a ghost. She never looked at my hands to see what they held. She only looked at my face to see if I was hungry. You, my son, were raised to be a sword, but a sword cannot rest. It can only cut or be broken." The old man leaned closer to the lens, his voice dropping to a rasp. She is the only family I have left, because she is the only one who doesn't know how to lie for a legacy. I gave her the land because it is the only ground I ever found that wasn't soaked in blood. Protect her, young. Not because of the law, but because she is the only part of me that is still clean. The screen went black, leaving the diner in a silence so profound the ticking of the wall clock sounded like a hammer. Young looked at the dark screen, then up at Janet, who was weeping silently. The succession was over. The chairman hadn't left a business empire. He had left a confession, and for the first time in his life, the Mafia boss realized that his father's greatest asset wasn't a bank account, but the woman standing in a stained red apron. The silence that followed the chairman's recorded confession was more absolute than the stillness after the gunshots. Han Young stood up from the linoleum, his movements no longer sharp or predatory, but heavy with the weight of a world he had finally seen for what it was. He looked at the older lawyer, whose hand was already reaching for the manila folder to salvage the legal narrative, and for the first time, Young's eyes flashed with a genuine human heat. "Enough," Young said, the single word echoing through the shattered diner like a gavel. "Sir, the fiduciary entanglement remains," the lawyer began, his voice practiced and dry. "The $50 million debt is a matter of record. We have a duty to the Han Young syndicate to—" "You have a duty to my father's memory," Young interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low vibrato. "And you have failed. You saw a predator where he saw a savior. You saw a debt where he saw a legacy." He turned to the younger bodyguard, his expression fixed. "Take them out. Inform the board that the Janet S. Wang project is closed. If I hear her name in a courtroom again, you will all answer to me personally. You're fired." The lawyers didn't argue. They saw the shift in his posture, the transition from a man following a script to a man who had just rewritten the ending. As they retreated through the glass-strewn exit, Young turned back to Janet. He didn't reach for the folder. Instead, he pulled a single separate envelope from his jacket, one that hadn't been touched by the legal team. He laid it on the scarred mahogany counter. "The documents they showed you were the syndicate's demands," he said, his voice quiet, almost a plea. "This is my father's truth. It is the deed to this entire block, the diner, the apartments, the land. It's yours, Janet. No strings, no tethers." Janet stared at the envelope, her eyes red and exhausted. "I don't want to be a part of your world, Han Young." "You aren't," he replied, a shadow of a smile finally touching his sharp features. "You are the steward of the only place that wasn't for sale, and you won't be alone." He tapped a second paper inside the envelope. "This is a permanent protection detail. My best men will be stationed across the street, invisible but present. Not to watch you, but to ensure that the peace my father found here is never interrupted again." He looked at the red stain on his shirt, then back at her. The hierarchy had vanished. The Mafia boss was no longer in control. He was simply a man standing in a sanctuary he didn't yet deserve. "You kept him safe for 3 years, he whispered. "Now it's my turn to return the favor." The seasons had turned 4 times since the glass was swept from the floor and the lawyers were cast out into the Chicago rain. The diner, once a fading relic of burnt toast and cracked vinyl, was now a vibrant heart in the center of the block. The sign outside had been repainted, and the flower boxes under the windows overflowed with the same vibrant wildflowers Janet had once kept pressed in her notebook. Inside, the air was warm, smelling of fresh yeast and the specialty barley tea that had become the house favorite. Janet moved through the lunch rush with a fluid, confident grace, her red apron clean and her posture no longer hunched under the weight of an invisible debt. The bell above the door let out a cheerful, familiar jingle. The room didn't go silent this time. The hum of conversation and the clinking of silverware continued unabated. But Janet felt the change in the air before she saw him. A single black sedan had pulled up to the curb. There was no fleet of cars, no lawyers with embossed folders, and no enforcers scanning the street for targets. Han Young stepped inside alone. He wasn't wearing the charcoal suit that cost a year's lease. He wore a simple dark sweater and slacks, his sharp features softened by a year of carrying a legacy that was finally his own. He didn't wait to be summoned. He walked directly to table 4. Janet finished pouring a cup of coffee for a regular and made her way toward the back booth. She didn't feel the frantic hammer of her pulse against her throat. Instead, she felt a quiet, shared understanding. She set a ceramic mug of barley tea down in front of him, the steam rising in a gentle white plume. "You're late," she said, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. The tea is at the exact temperature he liked. Young looked at the mug, then up at Janet. The cold, empty barrels of his eyes had been replaced by a weary, peaceful light. He didn't look like a man weighing a soul. He looked like a man who had finally found his way home. "I had a long flight," he murmured, his voice smooth and low. "The world outside is still very loud, Janet." "Not here," she replied, leaning against the edge of the booth for a moment. "Here, it's just the tea and the light." Young picked up the mug, the heat warming his hands. He took a slow, deliberate sip and closed his eyes. For the first time in his life, he wasn't a chairman or a sword. He was just a man at a corner table, finding his peace in a sanctuary built on kindness. Janet turned back to the room, her red apron a bright anchor in the bustling diner, ready to serve the next soul who needed a place to rest. The legacy wasn't in the land or the money. It was in the silence of table 4, where the ghosts were finally still.